Hello, my name is Charles Bedord. Are you curious about life in other countries of the globe and eager to learn about their cultures and histories? Well, stay tuned while we travel to Tibet and learn about the lives and struggles of Tibetan women. We'll also discuss the SkyTrain, what it is, and the changes it has brought to life in Tibet.
Welcome to The Better Part, a program that encompasses a diverse spectrum of topics important to our community, which we hope will both inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
My guest today is Canyon Sam, an activist, world traveler, and author of an award-winning book, SkyTrain: Tibetan Women on the Edge of History, which discusses the untold history of women in the remote country of Tibet and the changes that are occurring now as a result of China's economic growth. Well, welcome again to the show, Canyon.
Thank you.
And to start out, I've got to ask you, Canyon Sam is an unusual name. Can you tell us a little bit about its origin? Does it have any particular significance?
Sam is my family name. I grew up in San Francisco, born and raised. Actually, I went to the same high school as my father, third generation San Franciscan. So Sam is our family name, although it was not our real Chinese name, which is Lok. And Canyon was a name I took as a teenager. It's from Hawaii, Waimea Canyon.
I see. Very interesting. Now, how did you get interested in writing?
I got interested in writing in the 70s, and maybe in my early 20s, I took a writing class, and I've been writing ever since. That was maybe late 70s.
Your book deals with life in Tibet. Can you tell our audience a little bit about Tibet? Where is it located? Just an overview of the population, the economy, etc.
It's roughly between China and India, actually between Nepal and China. The population is about 6 million. It's a Buddhist country high up in the Himalayas. It's the largest, highest land mass on Earth. And the people were 80% pastoralists, meaning they just had animals, grazed animals.
I see. Interesting. And you mentioned Buddhist and Buddhism. Tibet, I think, Tibet is in many times associated with Buddhism. And can you tell us, how is Buddhism integrated into the Tibetan culture?
Well, most people know that the leader of Tibet, both the spiritual and political leader, is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. But Buddhism was integrated throughout the culture. Like every day, people would walk the holy walk around the sacred temple. The monastery, 1 out of every 4 persons was a monk or a nun.
Really?
Buddhism was integrated through and through the fabric of everyday life.
Now, what got you to Tibet? When did you visit, and for what reason?
I went to Tibet in 1986 in May, when it first opened to tourists. And I was actually on a year-long trip to China. I'm third generation Chinese American, but all through the 70s, of course, 60s, 70s, when I was growing up, we didn't hear anything about Tibet, about China, because China did not have any diplomatic ties to the West, and it was closed off behind the bamboo curtain. So when Nixon visited Mao in 1972, a few years later, organized tourism on a real limited basis began, and I went in 86 as a sort of solo backpacker for a year. I had a long list of places I wanted to go, and then I was going to also teach English. So Tibet was just on that list, and I met my very first day there. So this is the 5th week of my year-long trip. And my first afternoon, I met the only person in Lhasa who spoke English. And by the second day, I was living with her family in a 9th century monastery. So I was sort of taken in by this family and got special access to the Tibetan community there.
Now, you mentioned the language and being one of the few people who spoke English. Is there actually a Tibetan language, or is it separate, or is it kind of a conglomerate of several different languages?
No, it's its own language. It has, in fact, when they study it, they can't really find where it originated. It doesn't have any relationship to Chinese language, for sure. The written language came later and is based on written Sanskrit.
Oh, I see. Very interesting. Now, your book, part of the title is SkyTrain. And I remember when I first noticed the review of the book, it was in one of the local Bay Area papers, and they had a picture of a train going across a high plateau. Could you tell us, first of all, what is SkyTrain? Where does it travel, and why was it built? A little bit. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
What's called the SkyTrain is the new train from Beijing, the capital of China, to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, and took 9 years to build, and it opened in summer of 2006.
So it's very recent.
Very recent, and it's the highest train in the world. It goes up to 18,000 feet and back down to 12,000. It takes about 48 hours. The Chinese touted it as a way to help development and help tourism and so forth. But actually, there were other reasons why they built it that are more in their own self-interest.
I see. Do you feel the train is making a current difference in the culture of Tibet, or do you see that it will in the future?
Yes, basically it's brought in hundreds of thousands of Chinese immigrants to Tibet. I think the first days it had 4,000 to 5,000 people coming in from China to Tibet a day, and 2,000 a day stayed. So it's really shifted the population demographics in Tibet so that Tibetans are very outnumbered in their own country.
So this is a major route of travel now between Tibet and China. Before a SkyTrain, what was the major route of travel? Was it vehicles?
You could fly from Chengdu or from Kathmandu, but the main reason that the Chinese built the train actually was because they did a secret 7-year survey and found that Tibet was rich, positively wealthy in natural resources. That's gold, silver, zinc, copper, crude oil, natural gas, chromite, zinc, lead. Actually the train is a means for them to bring in mining equipment and personnel and take out the raw materials.
Oh, I see. So this is not just a passenger train. This also carries raw materials and industrial equipment.
It will.
Too.
That's the real reason they built it. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Now, your book, SkyTrain, Tibetan Women on the Edge of History, can you tell us why did you write this book and what is its main theme?
I found, I stayed, my whole trip around China for a year actually ended up revolving around Tibet because I took a real interest in the land and their history, the faith of the people. I found the people much more open and accepting and engaging than, the Chinese people, my own people. So eventually my whole trip revolved around Tibet. I traveled in Tibet, and then I traveled and lived in the Tibetan capital in exile in northern India. And then I came back to the States and was a full-time activist for Tibet, including helping start the Tibetan Nuns Project and being invited to speak before Congress after Tiananmen Square to link human rights in Tibet with human rights in China. Then I went back after the Nobel Peace Prize award to the Dalai Lama and lived in the government and helped the Tibetan government in exile, but I lived in the government compound. So I noticed there that there were no women, this is 1990, February, there were no women in the government, in the literature, in the religion. So I started an oral history project of Tibetan women, and that was way back, many years ago. So this book is actually just 4 of the 36 interviews, but interwoven as a memoir with my own going back on this new train 21 years later and finding the women.
I see. Now, you mentioned a term there, government in exile. For our audience, could you just explain what this means?
Tibet is now occupied by China, so the whole government, including led by the Dalai Lama, fled to India. So they have a capital in exile
okay.
in the Indian Himalayas in northern India. And so the real discovery, the important discovery I made, which actually is the motivating reason why I was committed to getting these stories out, was that I discovered that even though there are lots of books about the modern history of Tibet and excellent ones, all of them overlook the fact that the people who really suffered and who carried the burden of the Chinese occupation are women.
I see. Do you have a favorite passage in your book that you'd like to share with our audience, perhaps?
I'll read a couple. Let's see. This is from 1986. From the moment I arrived in Lhasa, I could sense something different. Even the air was different, pure and dry. The small plane landed on a vast, barren plateau. I'd never seen such long, clean horizon lines and such intense, indigo blue skies. There wasn't anything around. No buildings, no airport personnel, no electric lines, no signs, no indications of civilization. After a 2-hour bus ride, we arrived in Lhasa, where a few bicyclists leisurely pedaled along the wide, sunny main street. This was nothing like the jammed freeways of bicyclists I'd seen in other cities in China. Snow-capped mountains ringed the valley, towering behind soft-sloped brown moraine hills. Old ladies sitting on the sun-blanched street curb, fingering their prayer beads, tracked me as I walked down the main street and grinned as I passed, sticking out their tongues in the traditional greeting. I was struck by the bright white quality of the sunlight, the deep saturated blue of the massive sky, the air so crisp and clean it almost singed my lungs going down. I liked the relaxed atmosphere, the sense of space. Unlike everywhere else in China, Tibet was uncrowded, and one rarely saw a motor vehicle.
It's a beautiful picture. As you were reading there, my mind was just drifting, and I could just visualize it in front of me. That's very nice, very well written.
I'd like to read this other section, if I might. Let's see, sorry. Okay. So this is one of the women in the book, and she had a very dramatic story. Basically, when they were about to escape, her husband was about to take her and his other wife and their 2 sons. They were 2 sisters married to this man. Basically, the short story of it is that his best friend, who was also going to escape with them, was a high-ranking religious figure called a Rinpoche. And in a very sort of roundabout way, he objected to traveling with women. So she was left behind, and she was eventually put in this, what was modeled on a gulag. In other words, a forced hard labor camp, a slave labor camp, where they were not allowed to speak to each other and so forth. So, and they lived under very brutal conditions. You know, they lived on, for 3 years, they lived on 1 tablespoon of flour a day. And I asked her at one point how many men and how many women were in the camp. All women, she said. What? It was all women. But where were the men? She whisked the air with the back of her hand. They ran. All the men ran away. You mean, what, escaped, fled the country? Right. Only a handful of teenage boys and some monks were in the camps. Otherwise, The camp consisted of women and old people. Most of those tortured were women. I assumed that the camp would be roughly equal, a reflection of the general population. I remembered from her inventory of their farm that she had a keen head for numbers. About what percentage was women? About 70%, she said. The information hit me like a blow. I realized I had never thought about the Tibetan occupation splitting along gender lines before.
Is most of the population currently women?
No, not necessarily.
Oh, okay, I see. I see. And is there still a big divide now in Tibet between the rights and status of women and men?
Somewhat, I would say. But what's happening now that's more germane is that the Tibetan culture is completely being squeezed by China's economic growth.
I see.
A lot of what's going on is because they're moving the population into Tibet. So when you go to Tibet now physically, instead of looking, instead of traditional Tibetan buildings, which are 3 feet thick, mud and straw walls, and built to withstand the Himalayan winters and so forth, they've torn all the Tibetan architecture down, and they have blue glass skyscrapers, just like Beijing and Shanghai.
I see. So, do you plan on returning to Tibet? And if so, what's your time frame? Do you have a
No, I
time
have
frame?
no plans to return to Tibet.
Okay, okay. And back about your book. Your book recently won a major award. Can you tell us what the award was and the experience of receiving that?
It's called the PEN American Center, and it's the world's oldest, it's an international literature and human rights organization. It's all, and the American Center is the national branch, of course. It's almost 100 years old and dedicated to human rights. So they fight to lift censorship from authors and promote free speech for authors. And what I won was the Open Book Award. So it was for literary excellence by a book published in the U.S. by a writer of color.
I see. I bet you were quite honored, and it was a wonderful experience to go to New York and receive that then.
It was a huge honor, and I think one of the great things was that a lot of my family members and my friends accompanied me. My mother is almost 90. She hasn't traveled in almost 20 years, and she flew on the plane with me. And they sat us all in the first, all the awardees and the presenters in the first and second row, and all around me I realized, even though they look like completely normal people, were Philip Roth and Ann Carson and Don DeLillo and people that are major literary figures.
That's very impressive company to be with.
Yes,
I have to admit,
yes,
very
it is.
impressive. So now that you've written this book, and I know you've been on numerous other shows to talk about it, do you plan on writing another book in the near future?
No, I don't have any plans. I want to keep getting the stories of these women out, of their resilience, their courage. These are organized. I actually organized them so that they are, well, number one, I chose these women so that they portray people who knew Tibet when it was an intact society before the Chinese came.
I see.
And also they represent different aspects of Tibetan exile, which has gone on now 50 years. So one represents the invasion, one the occupation, one resistance, and one exile. So being that I sort of have this longitudinal view of them, because I visited Tibet before it became an economic powerhouse, China, and then 20 years later, it gives me a sense of the trajectory of the Tibetan diaspora.
I've got to ask you, is there a Tibetan community or multiple Tibetan communities in the San Francisco Bay Area?
Oh, yeah. When I began, being involved with Tibet, which was sort of the late, mid-'80s, there was about 30 or 40 Tibetans. Now there's something on the order of 3,000, you know, if you include the Mongolians and so forth, it's about 3,000 maybe.
Okay, so it's a relatively small community as far as ethnic communities go. Can you tell us a little bit about the stories of some of the Tibetan women that you describe in your book?
Well, one, for instance, they were all very inspiring and very courageous. One, for instance, was introduced to me or was recommended to me as sort of this amazing freedom fighter. She'd run this whole underground intelligence service in the early 80s. And it turns out she'd lost her husband, her son. The Chinese poisoned her 7-year-old granddaughter. She was a political prisoner. So she'd lost so many family members to the Chinese occupation. But I found her so grounded and so sane, and really she lacked any bitterness. She was capable of great joy and great warmth. And she was a really, really inspirational story. You know, she was also held underground in the dark in solitary confinement for 8 months. And then she was, after she sort of said, she said, I almost went a little crazy after 2 deaths in something like 6 weeks. In other words, they beat her husband and he died, and then they poisoned her granddaughter. She said, I thought I was going a little crazy, so I lobbied to get to another prison, because she said, at least if I was out of solitary confinement and I would be with other women, if I died, somebody would notice. So she was put in another prison, and she was in a cell with a dozen women, but they were not allowed to look at each other or to speak to each other. And still she organized them, she rallied them, she had them teach each other Buddhism and literature and so forth. And I think one really interesting thing I found out mid-course was that, you know, this whole phenomena we know about fight or flight, that in the face of physical survival and threats against one's physical survival, that you fight or you run. So gender, they've done a lot of gender studies and found that that is not true.
I see.
That men run or fight, and women do something very different. They do what's called tend and befriend. So they provide mutual aid, and they found that in 80% of natural disasters, whether it's tsunamis or earthquakes, plus man-made disasters like war, that 80% of the casualties are women, because men run and women look for their children, look for their relatives, look for their parents, and therefore they suffer more of the casualties.
I see.
So I was really interested in how that applied to this culture, which is a Buddhist culture, life-affirming culture, you know, but at the same time dominated by men, and, you know, a very traditional Asian culture in that way, male-dominated.
And you explore this in your book.
Yeah.
Quite. Okay,
Yeah.
very interesting. Do you have any advice, quick advice, for aspiring authors?
Just that you have to follow your passions, and you have to make more commitments and sacrifices than you ever thought you'd have to in order to get. It's a very crowded market, you know, especially in fiction and so forth, and you sort of have to find your voice. You know, this book took many, many years to publish, and it was because a lot of the years I got rejections, and the recommendation from people in the publishing world, agents and editors and so forth, was that I had to put myself in the book. And I resisted for many, many years, because I really didn't know, I didn't really want to be in the book. I just wanted to give them a voice.
Right.
And also I didn't find a way to put myself in the book until I went back, till the train opened up. And I decided to go back on the train and find the women again after many years. And that gave me a narrative framework. So it gave me a way of how to put myself in the book.
Well, that's very good and interesting advice for people who want to write their own books and be authors in the future. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to make about your future plans, the book, or any other aspect that we've covered today?
Well, I hope that people can find the inspiration that I did and the strength from these incredible stories that I did. I think they have a powerful message for us today because of our world and the times we live in that are very, very challenging. This was a culture that was completely isolated from the modern world. So they had no influence of capitalism, of Christianity. It was a very pure Buddhist culture for hundreds of years. So I think that's reflected in the national character, and I think that they are in touch so much with what is important for humanity, and I think that's something that we can benefit a lot from.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show, and I've certainly enjoyed talking with you and learning about Tibet and the history of women in Tibet. Thank you very much.
Thank you.